So, in case y'all can't tell, we're kind of related. This is my brother, James Mayo. He's going to do a presentation tonight on the recording history in Jackson, Tennessee, and the people that made it happen. I could have used this opportunity for a very interesting introduction, some stories. But then I got to thinking, that's a two-way street. So I figured the best thing I should do is just keep my mouth shut. And but he's also a genealogist. When I first started doing the genealogy work, I would send him stuff and be like, "Oh yeah, I need that." So and he's really good at that too. And he's a pretty good big brother. I'll give him that. So without further ado, James Mayo.
Thank you all. I have the tendency to roam around when I talk, so can you hear me? Do I need to be beside this, or we okay? Good. I don't think that's really doing much anyway. If you can't hear me, just tell me and I'll talk louder. I teach English at Jackson State. I have for the last, what year is this? 20 years, I guess, yeah. So I know how to manage my time when I'm speaking. The problem is I haven't done this since April, so I'm really sort of excited to talk in front of people again. By nature, if I just showed up tonight to visit, I'd be in the back, not talking to anybody, but if I'm up here, I get started and I don't stop. So he's gonna help me with time. If there's time left over, I will tell some stories. And that is a two-way street. I could have left after any kind of insulting stories, and that would have been your program, and that would have been a very good program, probably. But thank you for having me. The musical history of our city is musical history period is of interest to me. David's a musician, I'm a musician. We come from a long line of musicians, some good and some not so good. And we're trying to continue that line a little bit. So the music history of our area has always been of interest to me, and I was glad when David asked me to talk about this. I also wondered if he's scraping the bottom of the barrel as your program chair. But anyway, I'm here. I'm not going to worry about that part. That's his part. I'll come back next month and talk about the mounds or something. But anyway, I got to thinking this afternoon. I was putting this PowerPoint together, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a second. But I've got a very specific focus for tonight because I can't cover it all. But I got to thinking about this today. I was looking over this. It's a question that I've had for a very long time, but I don't have the answer to it. I don't think any kind of music historian has an answer to it. It's one of those questions you can't answer, probably, but I think I've got a good answer. And that question is this. What is it? We all know about Memphis, and we know about, the breakout of rock and roll onto the world in the 1950s. We know about Nashville and what that means to music. The Beatles, what that means to music. But what is it about this highway that runs between Jackson and Corinth that made a unique kind of music? And you could say, well, there's something in the water. Okay. I like to say there was something in the fire water, because I think that's the key to the whole thing. This is my theory, and it sort of came up to me again today. There are musical movements and cultural movements that have happened throughout our nation's history, or the world's history, for that matter. You have Elvis, you have rock and roll, right? You have the Beatles or Rolling Stones, you have the rock and roll movement, the attitude, the mood, the cultural moment, I guess, that goes along with that. You have Woodstock, right? The hippie movement. You have whatever. I think with the kind of music we have, we call it rockabilly music, but that kind of music we have in this area went the other way. I think the music came from the people who were in all those, what are all the terms here I'm looking for? Honky tonks, beer joints, nightclubs, supper clubs they called them sometimes. I don't think they had much supper. But I think, and those were pretty rough places. I've heard a lot of stories about those places. My father spent probably way too much time in a lot of those places. He's not here, so we can talk about that. And bands playing behind chicken wire so bottles don't hit them that are being thrown at them. And I think in some way that music came from the hillbilly music, which is not bluegrass, which is not folk, which is not country. If I played some for you, and I won't tonight, but if I played some for you, you would recognize it. real sort of fast-paced, guitar-driven music. The songs were often kind of silly and goofy and cheesy just a little bit. And I think these guys went into these places playing that music, and they weren't received very well. And that rough crowd kind of fed into what they did, and they fed it back with a whole kind of different kind of music. And believe it or not, I'm going to make it through tonight without talking about Carl Perkins. And he's the king of rockabilly, there's no doubt about it. He made rockabilly world famous. George Harrison comes to Jackson, Tennessee to go to his funeral. That's a big deal. But that was going on before Carl Perkins started doing it too. There were other people doing this. So I think I'll do this right. Yeah, I did. So my problem here, the real problem with getting this together, as I was thinking about this question too, was where to start, where to end. And so I've decided I'll focus on sort of that late 1950s, early 1960s, because that's sort of where my heart is. I know most about that. And also I want to let you know that, all apologies up front, what I tell you or show you tonight may not be accurate. You're all genealogists, right? Have you ever had a problem with that? Something
never worked perfect in every way, and that's
Oh, so I was doing an hour about mine one time after my DNA swab, and I went all the way and I found Charlemagne, and I was, Charlemagne, wow. I texted David and he was like, show me where you got that, and I showed him. He was like, you missed that one second wife in like 1840. Because the first wife was the one our relations come from, and I was like, well, I didn't notice that. So, I think that was the last day I did any genealogy. We've gone a long way. I was really proud of being Charlemagne's direct descendant. But there are inaccuracies here, and a lot of that is because a lot of this is not documented. You want documentation. You want to see something that gives you proof, right? When you're doing your stuff, whether it's something written down, or a record somewhere, a birth certificate, a death certificate, a will, something like that. What we have are stories from musicians, and that's dangerous. Because musicians, we're musicians, and I can say this, any other musicians in the room? We think a lot of ourselves sometimes. So often our stories about playing with so-and-so, after about the fifth tell, are going to be pretty plain, right? So we add a little color to it. So as a matter of fact, the chicken wire and a ball throwing might not even be true, I don't know, but I think that one is true. So the stories might not be accurate. There's information that is sort of contradictory sometimes about what we do know, and like who might have owned a recording studio with so-and-so, and I wasn't sure about the with the so-and-so, so I left that person out, because what I see most of the time is the one owner. So there may be some of that. I apologize in advance. If you catch me on something, please let me know. It doesn't bother me. I think the first one that I want to start with, obviously because it's my next slide, is Jackson Records. And this Jackson Records was owned by Jimmy Martin. And they had several artists on their label here in town. Now the current Jackson Records is named for this label. And it's, I've not been able to pin down really what years they operated. It was mostly in the 1950s. And I know that 1957 was one of their big years. They had several artists who recorded there. Just some of these names you've heard of. I know you've heard of Carl Mann, Eddie Bush, Kenny Parchman, and a lot of these folks, some of these folks went on to Sun Records in Memphis later and recorded there with Sam Phillips. In fact, Carl Mann, who recorded with Jackson Records, did his version of the Nat King Cole song Mona Lisa, which you may have heard of. He originally recorded that in Jackson at Jackson Records. He must not have been satisfied with it, or it was re-recorded anyway at Sun, and the Sun version went on to sell 1 million copies. So, but originally that was done here in Jackson. And I just have one of their covers here. And a lot of this is by the record collectors, is cataloged very, very, very well on the internet. I'm not real certain about the location. I've not been able to pin down where the original Jackson Records was. A lot of these facilities were not facilities so much as someone's house. So now Jimmy Martin, you can see his picture here with his band. As a matter of fact, Carl Mann is there with him. That's the tall guy with the guitar. Jimmy is on behind the drum kit, and Eddie Bush, the guitar player. I don't know Robert Oatsville, that's the first time I've seen that name. But here's one of his songs I want to play for you, because I was thinking about this today. I thought I could talk about this, but if you could hear some of it, that'd be probably a little bit more enjoyable than just my dull jokes.
Now people are talking, it's going round. The rhythm and blues is going down. Rocking and rolling just won't last, but I don't wanna be out of class. Come along, children, and listen to me. Rock the bop, the boodly bee bop bee. 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 Come along, children, and listen to me. Rock the bop, the boodly bee bop bee. I wanna rock the bop, roll the rhythm, gonna be real gone. Let's really get with it. Kick off of my shoes, let down my hair. Go, cat, go, don't you be no square. Come along, children, and listen to me. Rock the bop, the booty bee bop bee. 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 Come along, children, listen to me. Rock the bop, the booty bee bop bee. Rock the bop, the booty.
So I hope you can hear, there's that famous rockabilly feel, we would call it music. It's got that vibe to it, right? It's got the drive, it's got a lot of guitar in it, and that sort of, you can hear the scratchy sound you would expect to hear, which was important. And I don't say that because it's old, but that sound that we associate with rockabilly music, really echoey, and the echo chamber reverbs they were called later. I think a lot of that happened just by accident because they were recording in living rooms and maybe a warehouse or something like that, and it became the signature, and then later on that's reproduced with technology. Now today you can dial that up. You've got any number. Older brother is a recording engineer. He can pull up, his son is too, can pull up anything and say, oh, you want a 1950s reverb, click, here it is. And you're like, wow, that sounds like 1957, right? So you can hear also the piano was a very important part of that, and I think a lot of that comes from the church influence here in the South. That sounded like, when I was a kid, the church piano was slightly out of tune, and maybe like this one over here, and it's got that sort of I call it that sort of Count Basie, the jazz piano player, sort of came up with a double time. It was 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. So it goes over the beat twice, right? So that's sort of a signature thing, and that was recorded in 1957. And I mentioned, I don't think, yeah, I have a Carl Mann, he may be next. Well, there's Kenny Parchman. This song was also recorded at Jackson Records in 1957. This one's called Treat Me Right. And when this one kicks off, you will for sure hear that rockabilly feel.
Well, I'm crazy about you, crazy about your loving. I want you to love me. Treat me right, tell me you love me, and I'll keep around loving you. I don't like the way things are going, there's too many things I'm not the way. Treat me right, tell me you love me, and I'll keep around loving you. Now treat me right, be my love, treat me right, be my love, treat me right, tell me you love me, and I'll keep around loving you.
Keep ain't nothing of it. Treat me right. Tell me you love me and I'll keep around.
That's the screen, no. So a lot of guitar there. You got that sort of that walk down at the beginning, and a little bit of the sort of a, we'll call it a mistake on the player's part. It wasn't a little bit of recording glitch there at the beginning to kick it off. But they would go with that, and you know, if he and I were to sit down and record something, 4 or 5 people today, he would play his part, and he'd be done, and we'd listen to it. It's good. He could go home, then it's my turn. These guys would sit all in the same room at the same time. Somebody messes it up, I can't imagine the pressure. And I've done it that way before. As a matter of fact, we recut some rockabilly stuff back last year sometimes. We're all in the same room together, and we're like, okay, well, that was on you, so now we all have to start over again. So that's sometimes you just went with it, you know, in the early days especially, when they weren't so much worried about high fidelity. And there's your accuracy. We got IE, we've got Y. I mean, there's a lot of that, right? So, yeah, that song has a whole sort of different sound to it too. It's the same year as the other song, as the Jimmy Martin song, but it's got the quality's better actually. David was what we were chatting about. The instrumentation is a little bit different too. All right, so back to PowerPoint. Yeah, and Carl Mann, and I was thinking about this after I got started talking about the honky tonks these folks played in and how rough they were, and I mentioned Carl Mann's version of Mona Lisa. I remember reading, and this would maybe prove my point, and a real musicologist a music historian may argue with me, and that would be fine. I like to argue too. But he talked about playing Mona Lisa at a show in Kentucky somewhere for the first time, and the audience hated it. I mean, I don't know if they threw bottles, I don't know what happened, but he said they didn't like it. So later on in the set, they were short on time, he decided to do it again, which is a risky thing to do. Maybe thought, well, we'll do it better this time. They decided to play it faster, and it was a hit. The kids loved it, right? And they, you know, the kids back then. So that just shows you that sort of like, well, we can't do, I'll be careful saying this, I'm 53, so I'll say that up front. We can't do what our grandparents would want us to do, right? We don't want to hear that music. We want to hear something else. That's what they were there for. And this song, I really, I started saying dig this song. That would be a 1950s thing to say. This one by Carl Mann, there's no date on this one, but it has to be in the mid-50s before he went over to Sun. It's called Satellite. And I'm going to stop that right there and go back. Think about the 1950s and the space race, right? And this one called Satellite, and listen to the guitar at the beginning. Very spacey, right? You know, like radar.
Well, I'm a little boy by a little creek. I walk down the street. I came to the corner. I hear a little sound. And Sandy was jumping around and around. You know, that's satellite number 2. Yeah, let's dance, dance, dance. Everybody, let's dance, dance, dance. Let the satellite dance, dance, dance. Let's dance, 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 dance. Let's dance. Let's satellite number 2. Yeah.
I have to listen to the first one. All right, so yeah, did you hear Sputnik was one of the mentioned in there. Now a lot of, and I should point out too, because this song would be a good one to do it. A lot of these songs, and I did not go back to see what was what. I was too bogged down in details of when and where things were recorded. A lot of these songs were what we call cover songs. They weren't. This was not written by Carl Mann. This was probably a hit by somebody else somewhere and redone by Carl. All right, so let's see what's next. Oh yeah, Lou Records. Now Lou Records is an important one for me and David too. You may not know it yet. I have 2 of Lou's issues right here. I've already forgotten your name, I'm terrible. Ricky, I'm terrible with names. Ricky picked this up, he was talking about, hey, they would say, what's this hole? And I whispered to David, that's the part that I paid $200 for.
I laid it back down too.
You heard me then. But I do have 2 Lou 45s, I'm very lucky to have these. I had 3, one was a duplicate, and I gave it to a friend of mine, actually a friend from Spain who teaches Spanish at UT Martin, who is, David's met him, I think, yeah, Anton. He is a walking music historian. You can ask him about a song by Marty Robbins from 1958, he will tell you everybody who played on it and what date it was recorded, and in what studio, what time of day. You're from Spain, right? So I gave him one of these, he was very happy to have it, because it was a duplicate. But Lamar Davis had a record label called Lou. It was named for his wife, Mary Lou. And Lamar is important to me, and probably more so to me, but to me as Kai does. I live, now follow me on this, I call it the Rockabilly House. It's in Pinson, it's right next, you know where Woodland Hills Golf Course is. There's an old white house on the hill before you get there. It was the George Davis house for a while, it was J.L. Lawrence house for a while. Now it's the Scene Rock City house. We had that painted on our barn, Scene Rock City. It looks like a big billboard. We had a muralist come out and do that for us, and I made it look like a billboard. But Lamar was born and raised in the house that I live in. And I didn't know that when I moved into the house. My great aunt and uncle, J.O. and L.C. Lawrence, lived in that house. And I bought it from her when she moved to a retirement home. My father, they raised my father, he lived in that house. And he became a rockabilly musician. He never made the connection until I told him about it. I said, you know Lamar Davis who lived in this house? That's the same Lamar? Yeah. Okay. So I call it the Rockabilly House. It's just sort of line of people there interested in music. But he had a studio on North Royal Street. The house is still there. It's kind of a craftsman cottage just past the old Martha White place on the right. It's kind of a vacant lot and a house that's kind of covered in trees. Really dark house. I've driven by a couple times and looked at it. And that was where he lived, and I'm fairly certain his studio was in that house too. And he had this label between 1957 and 59, and he had some, and it is right, Lamar with 2 R's. He had a few artists who released with him 6 recordings. Curtis Hobach was a name around here. That Hobeck is how they spell his name on the record, as you can see. But it was Hobach. He was another, at least West Tennessee rockabilly musician or hillbilly musician. Lamar himself, he was more of a country performer, and Franklin Stewart. And like I said, I'm lucky to have these. It was kind of neat when I first got one of these to put it on a record player in our house after all these years and play it. It's kind of creepy just a little bit. I'm playing here's his voice in this house again. It hasn't been here since 1950 when they, whenever he would have left. Which leads us to Hillcrest. Hillcrest label was named after the Hillcrest Street out here off of Chester. And this is an important label. It's important for me and David, and I'll tell you why here in just a second. But it's also very important internationally. And I haven't said this, but you may already know, how much of our music from this area, this highway between Corinth and Jackson, is appreciated overseas. When we had the Rockabilly Festival here, the International Rockabilly Festival here, you always knew when it was going on. There were German guys walking around downtown with their hair slicked back and black leather jackets on. You're like, who are these people? And I got married at the courthouse and had a little get together across the street at the coffee shop in April, because they'd moved it back to the little cooler part of the year. It was full of foreigners there for the Rockabilly Festival. And I've got a good friend in France, virtually good friend I've never met. He'll email me a question he's asking about the article he's writing. He's a great Rockabilly historian. And I'll say, I don't know, but I'll go ask somebody and find out for you, or find an empty lot, take a picture and send it back to you. But, so Hillcrest is one that, in other countries, just like some of these, like the Lou's and some of the others, are very, very collectible and very popular. But Hillcrest was owned by Charlie Roach. I also had seen Lonnie, I will mention his name, I'm not real sure. Lonnie Blackwell may have had something to do with this label as well. They had just 2 releases, in 1959, and I'm pretty sure they operated out of Lamar Davis' studio on North Royal. So one of those was, I didn't know this until today. Tony Snyder and the Teen Kings released a single called It's You, and the B-side was Don't Ever Take Your Love From Me. And another one, the one you see here, was released by Billy Wayne and the Jackson Boys, also the Rockin' Bandits and Billy Wayne and something else, I forgot what they call themselves, many different names. But the Billy Wayne here is Billy Wayne Lawson, very well known guy. Yeah, he's from Bemis, worked in the cotton mill. His brother Terry was fixed my car many times. And it's important to us, and you can see that the record there, I do have a copy of it as well. I have a reproduction. I do not have, my older brother has an original, two originals actually, but I have a British-made reproduction. I mean, that's how popular this record is. And David and I are fortunate that our father played with Billy Wayne. That's him here. I love my dad, but I wish he'd kept that guitar. I wouldn't work now, probably. One of us would.
And what was your dad's name?
His name was Bobby Mayo.
Bobby Mayo.
And there's Billy Wayne, and Billy Wayne there in the middle, he was a straight, handsome crooner. I mean, they had a performance, a show every weekend in Corinth. It was called the Wildcat Jamboree. It went out on the radio, and somebody somewhere had recorded this, and someone in Europe released it on CD. So you hear the whole show, you hear the live advertisements. Hey, Bobby Soxers, if you're out riding around, pop in so-and-so Sinclair for your gas tonight, or whatever. And when Billy Wayne starts singing, they're screaming, and you can sort of visualize what that would be like, right? So that's and he was for sure a crooner. And this one's signed when they went into the Rockabilly Hall of Fame. I took it up there, but that's my dad on the left. That's Billy Joe, can't think of his last name. Wayne Collins, who's still alive, on the right. When we re-recorded some of this music back in January, Wayne actually played the drums with us. We weren't sure it was going to go. He's in his 80s, but he started playing. We were like, hey, he's still got it. Let's do this. So they had recorded a single in 1959. This one side is called Walking and Strolling, which would have been a dance. And the other one is I Love My Baby. Both songs written by Billy Wayne. Actually reviewed in Billboard, called a great rocker with moderate sales potential. And we'll listen to that now. The one we're going to listen to is I Love My Baby. It's not quite as rockabilly, but it's my favorite of the two. Still angry that they didn't run the volume of his guitar solo.
My baby, she drives me crazy.
He's mad about that. He's very, very long time.
Well, I love my baby with all of my might. When I get my baby, I'm gonna hold her tight. Love my baby, she drives me crazy.
I think I've got time for one more little bit of a story here, and I'll get back to the slides. But when my mother and a lady named Glenda, I don't remember her maiden name, lived in Corinth, and they were friends. And Glenda told my mom, hey, there's this guy I'm dating who sings in this band, and they're coming down to play tonight. Why don't you go down and meet them with me? And she showed me, I don't know how many times, we go to through car rent, we have to go to the old 45, right, and go through and look at all the stuff. And I don't know how many times I can show my kids where this is, and I already do that. We go every Memorial Day to the cemetery, National Cemetery, and they say, I know the corner, we know the four-way stop is where the bus was, and Billy Wayne gets off first, and my dad gets off behind him, and Glenda tried to introduce them, right? Bobby, this is Ann. And my dad said, hello, Red, I'm gonna marry you someday. And did. And Glenda and Billy Wayne were married as well. Kind of a nice little story there. All right, so Westwood Records, Charlie Roach from Hillcrest was, I know where this one was, on Taylor Street, which is just over off Hayes Avenue here, not too far behind us. Back here was where he was located in the house. He had 6 releases and operated from 1959 till about 1963. If you're hearing these dates, you can hear, even with Billy Wayne stuff, which was really good rockabilly music, it's just a little bit late in the game, which was also what Carl Mann said. He said if I hadn't been so young, I could have had a better career. So by 59, 63, it's starting to play out, but it's still happening here in Jackson. You can see the address actually on the record label there. And Larry Brinkley, I'm gonna play just a little bit of one of his songs because it's called The Jackson Dog, which I think was a dance, but I'm not sure. I know.
That's the Jackson Dog. I don't know nobody, that's the Jackson Dog. I don't know nobody that's shaking around that dog. Well, I've been to New York, I've been to Las Vegas. Oh, I've been to New York, I've been to Las Vegas. Well, I drove to the Jackson track.
And yes, this Jackson is talking about that. And Larry was also had a few singles at Jackson Records and also another little label down in Middleton, a couple of songs there. I'm not sure of others that he had though. So that was at Westwood in 1963. Now, I'm gonna bring this one up, and this sort of will wrap it all up for us here. Spectrum Records was also in Jackson, Tennessee. They had about 10 singles that came out that I know of. Kenny Parchman was one of the artists who recorded with Spectrum, maybe from 145. They were operating from 71 through 74. And I'm only gonna mention them because they were in Jackson for sure, but they're sort of stretching out of where my main focus was here. But I thought this might be of interest to you. One of their records, and it's the most interesting one to me, was the 1972, stick with me, Jackson-Madison County Sesquicentennial Souvenir Album. Right? Now, featuring these voices, Mayor Bob Conger, and it doesn't say what he says. I mean, this is a catalog listing telling me what's on the record. I have not heard it.
So we don't know if Bob's singing or if he's talking.
I'm hoping he's talking.
Okay.
I remember his name. I never met him, but I remember his name. I think he was talking. I think he may have said voice narration, actually. Joyce Reynolds and Rayburn Anthony, and I should mention Rayburn as a prominent local musician here too, who also was with Son. They did a song together on the album. Homer Jones from Pinson, who was the president of the farm, said president of the Farm Bureau. I assume he was talking or singing about agriculture. Talking, I hope. Maybe he was selling insurance, I don't know. There were church choirs, 2 or 3. Help me with this one, a rocking chair marathon.
There
Okay, all right. I was afraid to Google it, I was at work. But a rocking chair marathon. Emma Williams from, you know her name, right? Madison, help me, Historic Madison. Jack Smith and Ernest Franklin, those are names prominent in our town. I've never seen a copy of this album. The library may have it.
We do.
There you go. So maybe next time y'all need to bring a record player and listen to see what Mayor Congress got to say. So, and I think this is pretty cool because now we're talking about our own bicentennial. So yeah, I was involved with ours at Pinson. I think we were one of the first ones to have a celebration. So pretty neat little idea there. And I'm gonna show you this one just because I love the name of the band. The Kawasaki Good Time Band. I don't know really who they were or what they did, but they had a record on Spectrum that was a cover of a Ray Charles song called I Got a Woman. And I will play it for you because even though it's about 1975 or 74 when they recorded this, and they're just probably just a local band, it has very much a rockabilly feel to it. So I got it. I think I figured it out. I don't do PowerPoint a lot. Yeah, it worked.
I got a woman way across town. She's good to me, so good to me. I got a woman way over town. She's good to me, so good to me. When I see my baby, I know
That
you
that's that song,
understand.
Ray Charles.
And I said, I will love you, baby. I got a woman way over town. She's good to me. Oh, she's good to me. She's made a love me every day and night. Follow my footsteps, always treat me right. If I walk the street today, look at me alone. She knows that woman's pleasure right now.
Musician you went to
Do
school.
we know who was in the
I
Kawasaki
could not
band?
find anything about it at all. I'm gonna assume they're named after a motorcycle. And they like to ride their dirt bikes.
Kawasaki motorcycle.
Right, absolutely.
Cause they were just starting out big right about then. the
I would say,
Kawasaki
oh yeah,
motorcycle.
I would just say that they probably, and I like to think they were just a band that played everywhere around here. So I'm gonna go with that. That may be all every day. What's that? Yeah, they had a good feel to it. So anyway, that sort of is a good place for me to stop, I suppose. And I appreciate your listening to all that, and then I'll entertain. I may not answer, but I will entertain any questions that you might have. If I don't know the answer, I'll do the musician thing to make something up.
How many labels did you discuss tonight?
Oh gosh, let's see, Spectrum, Hillcrest, Lou, Jackson, and Westwood, 5. And I mentioned the one down in Middleton, the name of that one escapes me. And there were others, we know now, and it hasn't been that long since this came out, that, I know I'm focusing on Jackson, that's what I know most about, but there was some recordings in Eastview, from Carl Perkins. Early, I thought I said I wouldn't do that. Not that he doesn't deserve it, but it's like, it's always about Carl. There's so many others. Back way before he was anybody, and long before Elvis walked into Sun Studios and said he wanted to make a record for his mother. I don't remember the year, but they were found and released just a few years ago, recorded in Eastview, early 1950s, and it is straight up rock and roll. Like before anybody had even discussed that idea. You listen to it and it's just like you would have heard Carl Perkins playing Blue Suede Shoes 5 or 6 years later. Like, so he was doing that. Where he got it, again, where any of these guys got it, where it came from, we could debate all night, but that was another one, and there had to have been more. It's just, people recording in their houses as technology became available to them. Just a little reel-to-reel machine. Just a 1/4-inch tape on it, you could record something. And whether or not you could get it pressed, and I don't know where these records were pressed, made into records. I don't know, I doubt that was a local thing, but it could have been. But yeah, those, and there are plenty more. It's just requires digging and digging, as y'all know, what you do.
How common are the singles? How common are they?
How common? Very, very uncommon. Unfortunately, that's why I'm lucky to have 2 of the Lou records. I mentioned Curtis Hobop recording on, his picture was on, his Lou record was up there with his name spelled incorrectly. That's a $500 to $700 45. And no, any kind of condition at all. It doesn't matter if it's scratched or not scratched. There were just not many of these.
Is there any kind of guess of how many of a record like that would have actually pressed?
I know that from the one that my dad was on with Billy Wayne at Hillcrest, that they made 1,000 copies of this. And this one, again, I paid about $75 for a British 1970s bootleg. And we call them bootlegs. That's probably not accurate because a lot of these things are not protected by any kind of copyright anymore. We've heard people today recording other people's music here in Jackson anyway, probably without permissions. But an original, and my brother has two. He had the one my dad had that we all grew up listening to, and that he had signed at some point along the line, and he'd given my mother, I believe. And when we did our recording session last year with Wayne on drums, Wayne gave him his copy. And the original copy they had made in Nashville at a walk-in studio where you could just walk in and pay money and make a record. But yeah, this one now, if you were to run across an original of this, it would be a $700 to $800 45. And I'm not going to pay that much for it, but I think about it because my dad's on it, but I'd probably just keep my bootleg.
And you just trade them on eBay, or where do you go?
eBay, yeah, it's the best place. I mean, I go to like a record, you go to Carriage House Antiques, they've got records, but you can do this all day through the 45s because they're not even in these, they're just stacked up.
Right, the thrift store has a big bin.
And I've tried that, but after about 5 or 10 little loops through, I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna find anything here. And it's just so much easier just to search, you know. But I've seen these go, where I haven't seen them go, but I've seen where they have sold. I've never seen one up for sale. The Lou's I have, but the Jackson records, I've never seen one. And they had a lot of releases. They had at least 25 45s that came out. I've never seen them. And that they may be prominent around. The library may have some, I don't know. But or somewhere around here, somebody's got some. That we know.
So after these groups recorded these songs at these different places, where did they send that recording to get that pressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say probably Memphis or Nashville would offer those services if there was not a local way to do it. And I know a lot of those, like the original one that Billy Wayne and his guys did in Nashville at Revis that my brother has is basically crumbling. He gave it to him and he just said, okay, let me put this over here. And he wanted to come out to my house and put it on the floor, because I have a record player, and put it on there and it hooks up to the computer. And I said, well, bring it out one day. We might get one shot at playing this record before it falls apart, and we can get it moved over digitally. Because it won't be the same as the one they recorded here in Jackson. Or it might be, we don't know. There's some debate with Wayne, adamant. We recorded that record in Nashville. We've not recorded in Jackson. Billy Wayne told me, North Royal Street right up here with Lamar Davis, we recorded that record. Right, so, but he has it, walking and strolling, but he doesn't have the flip side. So I think maybe they did one there and did one here. My dad had no memory of working, and never mentioned, I should say, working on that in Nashville. But he was upset because there was a saxophone player in the room, and the recording engineer said, hey, no, actually he wasn't a saxophone player, that was the problem. He said, let's get this guy to play a little saxophone on this record. And they were like, I don't know about that. And he just sort of like played some notes to the song, and they weren't happy with that decision that somebody made, but that's on the record. I wonder if it's on the original in Nashville. But yeah, it's a great question. Just not sure of the answer.
And then once they got the records pressed and got back to the artist, then at that period of time, how did they distribute them all out to radio stations and get
Visits.
Followers?
Visits.
Just on the road, just going
What's that?
place to
Pop
place?
tunes,
Oh yeah.
they were
Yeah.
distributing back then.
Yeah, and you know, that's like, say Carl Mann had a radio show before, when he was young. I think he was on WDXI, that would have been right. Not TGS, DXI, every Saturday morning. So doing that, maybe give them to y'all seen coal miner's daughter, just driving around
Yeah.
and giving them out, right, or going
Yeah.
to shows and giving them out that way. And now, what always intrigued me about once I found out about it, about the Hillcrest record with Billy Wayne, and I didn't know until today there was another one that was recorded by Hillcrest, was that it made it to Billboard, and I don't know how that happened. It was in the regional sales column, and I should have brought a copy up to show you a little print off of it. But I don't know how they got a hold of it and reviewed it, but they did. But again, a lot of these things, because they're out in the public domain now, are very easy to find on Spotify or on CD, not because of us, unfortunately, I hate to say that, but because the Europeans absolutely love it. Absolutely love it. I showed my dad the stuff on the internet, and he was like, I'm on the internet. And he was all, I said, there's a lot more about you on the internet than you care to know. Right? One thing I found out about him he did not like. In the Ancestry.com thing. So, my question to him was, do I have a sibling somewhere? But anyway, yeah, that's, it's thanks to them. I've got multiple compilations of rockabilly stuff from Tennessee.
So what's Jackson Records doing today?
Jackson Records, Jimmy Exum's place. They still record there. That's I'm not sure how much recording they do, but they still have a full studio set up. And it would be nice if I found out if that was actually where the first one was. It's probably not, but it's but they still do recordings there. They have a very professional setup.
Who owns it now?
Jimmy Exum.
Jimmy who?
Exum.
Exum.
Yeah. Yes. If you've
Gotcha.
ever been to one of the amp shows, he's the guy who makes the announcement at the beginning. Yeah. He does the bookings for the amp show. Jack.
I'm just gonna ask, all of the musicians that you featured tonight, were those all native Jackson people, or did they come in from other areas and record?
They were all West Tennesseans.
Okay.
I'll put it that way.
Carl Mann was Carroll County.
Carl Mann was from Huntington, I think.
And Eddie Bush was from Hardeman County.
Yeah, Hardeman County for Eddie Bush, and I'm trying to think of where Kenny Parchman was from. I was looking at it today. But yeah, certainly in the area. Throw a rock. And but they would be pulled here. There's the great quote that's still on the mural down by where the Rockabilly Museum was. That says, I forget the person's name. It was in the PBS documentary. It says, "Rockabilly music started in the dance halls of Jackson, Tennessee." And that's where it started. Again, why? Who knows? But this is where they would come naturally to do that. And who knows if there wouldn't have been a place in Huntington where one of them was from, where Carl was from, where they would have recorded small label stuff. It's a rabbit hole. You can go down in it and never, like y'all know, I'm talking to genealogists here.
Yeah. I got one quick story about Carl, which we always referred to him as Cousin Carl. He was related to us down the line. And one time my aunt, back in the 70s, she said, "Oh, it's not that hard to write a country song. I can do that, So she sat down and wrote out something. Unbeknownst to her, one of the lines was from, what's her name? Janis Joplin.
Oh, yeah.
So she gives the music, she gives the words to Carl and hums a little tune, and she said, and he, she reconnected with Carl, and she said, "You remember me, blah, blah, blah," and he says, "Oh yeah, I remember you." So anyway, he says, "I'll be glad to record that for you." He said, "But I'm gonna warn you, sometimes you think this is your words, but it's something you've already heard."
Right.
So he had to explain to her that part of the song, the best part of it, was actually Janis Joplin. But he did a recording for her.
Right.
And, it was very kind of him to
Oh,
take the
absolutely.
time to do that.
And he had a great voice.
Yeah.
Really, really good voice.
Really nice.
My grandmother swore up and down on my mother's side, and she played the guitar and wrote songs, that she had sent in a song, one of those things in the magazine. You see them in the back of the old magazines, write a song and we'll publish it for you. She said she sent that song in and never heard anything back from these people, and she was listening to the radio one day and she heard Eddie Arnold singing it. And she told me the name of the song, but I've forgotten it, and of course there'd be no way to prove it. Of course, then Eddie Arnold from just down the road, and I'm from Pensonian and Pensarutan, member in the old school building down there where he went to school. And I can tell you how upset I was watching Ken Burns' documentary on country music when they got to the part about Eddie Arnold, and they said, born in a small town near Henderson, Tennessee. I thought, couldn't you just said Pinson? That's our one chance to be home. But you couldn't just say that, could you? Ken Burns, I was looking for his email address.
Isn't it ironic how you take for granted what's from your own town, that we take so much for granted, just rockabilly.
Absolutely.
Several years, 10, 15 years ago, Brenda and I had gone to St. Louis to fill my bucket list by going to a Bob Seger concert.
Mhm.
So I thought I died and gone to heaven because I'm seeing Bob Seger. The couple next to us said, where are you from? And I said, Jackson, Tennessee, and he nearly fell out of his chair. He said,
Absolutely.
you're kidding, do you know Flu Collin?
Right, exactly.
He could have cared less about seeing Bob Seger, but he said,
Right.
man, we travel the country for rockabilly.
Right, and and maybe that's, Jackson's really the place I've lived the most, but maybe that's common wherever you go. You know, I have my students who write papers about how there's nothing to do in Jackson, and I'll have a student who's originally from Chicago, and so there's nothing to do in Chicago. Nothing to do in Chicago, what are you talking about? So maybe it's just that local, I don't know, maybe it's that sort of familiarity, you know, and it's just, we kind of let it go by. I hated when, and that's another loss when Henry Harrison died. I mean, there's a lot of information there, that's gone, and, it's not as well documented as a lot of other forms of music, and that's sort of the sad part of it. And it's yeah, you can go way down there. A funny story about Fluke Holland and Johnny Cash, a friend of mine, his family had a little junk store in Pinson, just past where the convenience store is. It was the Evans family that sold clothes and whatnot there. It's where that air compressor place is now, if you know Pinson. And Willie said he was there one day when he was a kid, and a big black Cadillac pulled up in front of the place, and it was Johnny Cash. He got out of the car, and they went in the store and looked around, and WS was with them. And my assumption is they had come to Jackson to get him, and they were going somewhere. And he said they looked at everything, and Johnny put on a women's fur coat that didn't fit him real well, and said, how much is this? And they told him, and he said he paid for it and walked out the door wearing it, and got in the car and drove off. And speaking of clothes, Wayne was telling us when we were recording that night with, you know, the Billy Wayne song about how they were making it big now, and they went over to Memphis to some place to get their duds, because you had, well, yeah, you had to have those, that Elvis look, right? Yes, that's it. And he said we had these green velvet pants and a pink velvet jacket, and he said shoes that looked like elves wore that curled up on the toes. And he said, I don't know why we got talked into that, but we're coming back and we're out here on 57 somewhere and had a flat tire. And we're all out of the car, standing around, trying to figure out what to do. People pulling up saying, y'all need some help, then they would drive off right But that's, yeah, my dad remembers his, he said he remembered his black pants with a pink stripe down the side.
He took the stripe off. They took the stripe off.
Oh, that's what it was, yeah, they had to have the stripe on the side, and he pulled his off, that's what it was, he didn't like it.
Did your dad ever do any studio work over in Memphis or Nashville?
No, he didn't. My dad, he never really did. It was just one of those cases, and I think it bothered him all his life, honestly, where he was a great musician, but just never got there.
Yeah.
Which is the case with a lot of musicians. And Billy Wayne did some work later on, more country, crooner type stuff, and had a few singles in the early 70s over Texas, but for the most part, that was what he did too. But my dad eventually became a banjo player. Was a member of the Plectral Society for a long time. So that's.
He went country.
He went way country. He went way country. Sure did. And he was kicked out of the house that I live in now for, he was given a choice when he was 17 to stay in the house or play the devil's music. And you know which one he chose.
That's a crossroads.
And it's right, and school and all that was left behind, and he went to play music.
Billy Wayne Rawson's wife, Glenda, had a like a dance studio where she taught baton.
Yeah, that's right. A flower shop.
And that was in the 1960s.
Yeah, she had a flower shop too.
I don't remember that.
That's it, yeah.
Oh, really?
Her grandson is a great baseball player with the Colorado Rockies, I believe. All right, great, thanks for having me, I hope I didn't talk too long.